Chapter 4. The Real World. Jim took off his loud red Hawaiian shirt with its sunny white flowers and vivid green leaves, wadded it up tightly, and attempted to skip it off the water, and didn't get more than one skip before sinking. It wasn't like he'd have to go and get it. No matter how many times he took it off, it would reappear in his body after 5 minutes. If he had a watch, he would have timed it exactly just to pass the time, and it certainly wasn't that he would ever want the shirt back. Despite looking like cotton, it felt like wool. It was impressive that the shirt had a feel about it at all. The simulation was extremely well done. No matter how close Jim looked, he couldn't see anything artificial about the shirt. He could see every thread and stitch. The shirt even said "Made in Virtual India," and had the humorous washing instructions of, "Seriously, it's not real, you can't wash it." But despite all of the care put into recreating the shirt, it still felt heavy and itchy. How was it feel so far off? And of course he couldn't get rid of it. But it was amusing Jim to try. Out of the corner of his eye, Jim spied the gray fin of his second little buddy bearing down on the shirt. Like a dart, the impressive great white shark, Jim lovingly called Charlie, briefly popped its head out of the virtual waves just long enough to wrap its few dozen menacing sharp teeth around the helpless shirt, swallowing it whole before vanishing beneath the water again. As Charlie vanished beneath the waves, it did so with a little flamboyant flip of its tail. Surely this was a feature some programmer proudly added to give the sharks some extra pizzazz. Jim appreciated the effort. He didn't appreciate the shirt, though. Back when Jim still had a flesh and blood body, Jim would never go to the beach shirtless. He burned like gasoline-soaked tissue paper in the sun and was just as pale white. What few times he did go to the beach, he wore a long shirt to cover his unflattering belly, and a large tan hat just to stop his impressive bald spot from burning. Jim never had what you'd call a beach body, unlike the body he currently had in the simulator. This fellow was toned, buff, and tan. He would have liked to feel proud of this fake body, but a little nagging voice in the back of his mind always reminded him, "It's not your body, fatso." Jim's nagging voices were always so rude. Jim looked around at the sand in his mighty kingdom of sand castles. Maybe he wasn't really an at-the-beach sort of guy. Some people can sit around in a hammock all day and enjoy the sound of the surf, but this sort of thing was driving Jim crazy with boredom. The only thing that felt remotely productive was building sand castles, and at this point Jim had more of a sand country. Maybe two? It was only a matter of time before the two sand kingdoms went to war. Maybe all that time in the void had left lasting scars on his sanity. If Nate called him crazy, he wouldn't deny it. What he did know for certain was one of those sand kingdoms would be run by the soda lords. And oh my god, the sodas. The one and only thing Jim could consume in the simulator, and they were completely broken. Every time he opened a bottle, it was something completely different and terrible. Despite names like Mango Surprise and Grape Explosion, they all contained some random food with the aftertaste of something extremely wrong. He actually didn't mind the spaghetti and asparagus soda, but the peanut butter and calamari was just too much. Not one single soda was actually fruit-flavored. Never fruit. Jim had tried tossing out one to see if Charlie would eat it, but even the shark apparently had higher standards. The surf had brought the bottle right back to shore, ensuring that, given enough time, Jim would still likely end up drinking it anyways. And he did. It was French onion and ham. He had worse. Jim didn't mind the bizarre sodas that much, though. Even something gross was still something. Having spent years without any sense at all, even a terrible soda was still worlds better than nothing. But man, these flavors were testing his patience. Also, try as he might, Jim couldn't break the bottles. He tried smashing them on the tree, on each other, on his head, even on Bob, although the latter felt like animal cruelty. Who's Bob, one might ask? Bob was the turtle. Or was it a tortoise? Jim had named everything on the small island. He had named the two trees Stan and Lee, but he always got confused which was which since the island was so symmetrical. Every morning Bob would crawl out of the ocean, only to return in the evening to keep Charlie company. Apparently sharks and turtles get along fine, or at least they do in simulations. These were Jim's only two companions when Nate was away, and Nate was away more and more these days. Having helped Jim find his way out of his endless, empty prison and into something a lot more colorful, Nate didn't hang out as much as he did before. Jim couldn't blame him. Fixing Jim's case had been Nate's obsession for weeks. But it had been nearly 2 weeks since starting the simulated island, and each day Nate seemed to come by less and less. 3 days earlier, Nate didn't show up for an entire day, leaving Jim in a blind panic for several hours. He built so many sandcastles that day. Jim wondered if this loneliness is what parents felt after their children leave home. Of course, that was stupid. Obviously it wasn't. Nate wasn't Jim's son. If anything, Jim was more like Nate's pet project than any kind of relative. Jim couldn't even be certain Nate thought of him as a friend. The boy wasn't heartless, but Jim could see he wasn't much help to Nate. Maybe that was Jim's negativity creeping in? Still, he worried Nate might eventually forget about him entirely like some Tamagotchi left to rot in a drawer. Despite the sunny beach setting, Jim was still entirely helpless, utterly reliant on the boy for everything. Nate was his only lifeline, and at this point, Jim couldn't even think of a way he could find anyone else to help him. It was unfortunate the little girl turned out to be such a psychopath. If anything happened to Nate, Jim had no one else to turn to. He'd be all alone again. Since Nate had created Jim's tropical paradise, Nate hadn't done too much else to help Jim's condition. Not that Jim was ungrateful. The crazy beach with its sand and weird sodas was certainly a paradise compared to the black, empty void, but it seemed like Nate had hit a wall on helping Jim any further. For instance, Nate couldn't get Jim any form of internet access. It seemed after the Jonah collapse, all forms of broadband had been locked down for just the wealthy and connected. Automated cyber tracking software and police raids made certain none of the Rift Raft could get online for much more than basic text data. What bandwidth remained was policed very thoroughly for sedition, criminal activity, or just anything that seemed rude. Even basic search engines were restricted to authorized access only. Still, Nate found a way of getting information for his projects, including learning how to save Jim in the first place. But despite all of his technical expertise, he couldn't get Jim access. Not that Jim had a whole lot of people to contact anyways. Before the fire, Jim did have the contact information of the people who left the New Use server farm before the Jonah collapse. He never used it though. It was very dicey to contact anyone who left New U. The company said that any such contact would be a breach of service and could end in the eviction from the server farm. It was rumored that it wasn't entirely out of New U's legal rights to drop their unwanted members in a dumpster out back. Still, much like many others, Jim had hidden some notes in case he was ever forced to leave New U. But those existed as virtual objects in a virtual room. With the fire, that data was destroyed like everything else. Try as he might, Jim couldn't for the life of him remember a single address. Without access to a search engine, there wasn't even a means to look them up. Nate said he would keep an eye out for other neural encasement groups, but as far as he knew, the last bucket geezers in 1,000 miles died when New U was destroyed. Nate might have gone back to find some more working neural encasements, but from what he told Jim, the place was no longer safe to salvage. Since Nate had pulled out Jim's case, other street rats took notice and started swarming the building looking for things to sell. A particularly unpleasant-sounding group called the Bloody Eye took over after that and locked the whole place down. As much as Jim wanted more of his old life back, and possibly save some of his friends from offline limbo, Jim certainly didn't want to put Nate at risk. If there were any other survivors, Jim could only hope their lives retained more value than the metal their cases could be melted down for. Just the thought of it made him shudder. Jim might have spent another hour or two introspectively considering both his own and Nate's future, but he was interrupted by two events. The first was the ugly Hawaiian shirt appearing back on his body, its itchy fabric immediately irritating his shoulders and neck. It was dry, free of shark saliva, but no less unpleasant. The second was the loud crash of a metal door being kicked in by a very unpleasant group of individuals.